Okay, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning study, and I'm glad to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us on this holy Sabbath. Today's class, I wanted to do something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about the title of the class is The First Coming. I wrestled with this. I almost called it The Sign of the First Coming. We're going to get to both of those ideas as we work through the material today. The story today is going to unfold, so stay with me. We'll be working in our Bibles today. Hopefully you have your Bible ready. Mark asked me this morning, are we going to be doing a little bit in the Bible today? And the answer is yes. So I look forward to today's class. Today's story actually begins at a bush. The story of the bush. All right, now some of you might know where I'm going with this. It begins at the bush with a shepherd tending flock. In this particular story, you recognize that I'm coming to you from the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. In Exodus chapter 3, we are exposed to this narrative of Moses, who is out tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, and he's in a particular place known, according to the writer of Exodus, as Horeb. It's also called Sinai. And he sees that a bush is on fire. He approaches because he's very interested as this unfolds before him, and he says, I have to go look at this. The bush is on fire, but it's not consumed. And he begins to approach, and a voice comes to him from the bush and says, take off your shoes, for this is holy ground. And this particular story also includes the revelation of the name. We've been talking about, last week we had a class on the name of God. It's at this particular passage in Exodus chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, where following the response of Moses, Moses says, what's your name? He says, I will be. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. Tell the people that I will be has sent me to you. Now, initially, when I began studying this week, I originally thought that I would cover the subject of the meaning of God's name, but that's going to be on hold. I'll probably pick that up next week unless I'm inspired to do another topic, because I wanted to talk about something very specific that's relevant for today. And so I'm going to move to this idea of the bush that's on fire. So if you would, go with me to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, and I will be covering quite a few passages this morning. But in Exodus chapter 3, I want to pick up in verse 11, and Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt? Notice the answer. And he said, certainly I will be with you. In other words, the answer is, his question was, who am I? Moses' question is about him, and God says, I'll be with you. In other words, it doesn't matter who you are, because I'll be with you. And that's a good point I think all of us need to remember in life, is that if God is with us, it doesn't matter who we are. In fact, it's probably better if we leave us out of the equation as much as possible. But I'll continue. And he said, verse 12, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. You shall serve et Elohim ol hahar hazeh. You will serve the Elohim upon this mountain. I want to talk to you today about the sign of his coming. Now remember, in the context, in Exodus chapter 3, what we have is a burning bush and a voice coming out of a flame. This is very important because he's given a sign, and the sign is what I just told you. You're going to worship God, Ha Elohim, upon this mountain, and the sign literally is that the voice will come out of the fire. And I'll set forward to show that as we work through the class today. So move with me to Exodus chapter 4 and verse 21. Exodus chapter 4, verse 21. And Jehovah said unto Moses, when you go to return to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all those wonders which I have put in your hand. But I'll harden his heart, and he will not let the people go. And you shall say to Pharaoh, thus saith Jehovah, Israel is my firstborn, my son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if you refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay your son, your firstborn son. One of the things that comes up over and over in the Exodus narrative and in the story that I want to present today, two ideas. One is the word shalach, which is generally translated to send forth. And Moses uses it of himself. Who am I that you would send me forth? And God tells him, I am sending you forth. And over this word occurs. We're going to go through several passages. One of my favorite, as I read through the Exodus narrative in Hebrew, I love the way this rings. Now, people who are really good at Hebrew, who aren't maybe hampered with a Louisiana accent, might not say it as well as I do, but you could practice. So if you want to sound like me, I like the way it rolls off my southern accent when I say shalach et ami. Shalach et ami. Now, this is generally translated, let my people go. Now, I translate it in my limited knowledge, send forth my people. I don't see it so much as a jussive, asking permission. I see it more as a command. Shalach et ami. We'll see this over and over and over. But this is the charge. Now remember, he's told you're going to go before the leader of the world and you're going to tell him to send my people forth. Now, but I want to pick up on the other word. For what purpose are the people of Israel to be sent forth from servitude to Pharaoh? And that is very simple, and it's stated repeatedly, to serve me. To serve me. Israel is to become the servant of Jehovah through this Exodus that is mapped out for us in the biblical story. So, what I want to do is I want to just go through and read a couple of these passages. Look with me to Exodus chapter 7. Exodus chapter 7 and verse 16. 7:16. And you shall say unto him, Jehovah Elohim of the Hebrews has sent me to you, saying, let my people go. Shalach et ami. Let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. That they may serve me in the wilderness. So it's not just let my people go. It's not just send my people forth. There is an end game in mind from the very beginning. You're going to send them forth so that they can serve me, and here it's pretty specific, in the wilderness. Remember, Exodus chapter 3, the sign is that you will serve the Elohim upon this mountain. Now go with me to verse 26, chapter 7, verse 26, and let's see, it's different in the Hebrew. In the Hebrew, it's 7:26. I believe in the English, it's 8:1. And Jehovah spoke unto Moses, go to Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Jehovah, let my people go that they may serve me. All right, look down at chapter 8, verse 20, which is verse 16 in the Hebrew. And Jehovah said to Moses, rise up early in the morning, stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he comes forth to the water, and say to him, thus says Jehovah, Shalach et ami, send forth my people, that they may serve me. You see, this is something that I want people to get as we go into today's class, is that there is a very specific reason that Moses is told by Jehovah to go to Pharaoh, and that is this. They're not going to serve you anymore. They're going to serve me. So this is a difficult message. You'll see as we work through these particular texts. Look at chapter 9, verse 1. Jehovah said to Moses, go into Pharaoh and tell him, thus says Jehovah, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. Then he goes on. In each of these cases, he tells him of subsequent blows, plagues that will strike them should they not be allowed to leave. And we know God told Moses from the very beginning that he's not going to listen. And he doesn't, over and over and over. Look down at verse 13, a couple more of these. And Jehovah said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning. Moses had to get up early, not just go before Pharaoh, but go early. And stand before Pharaoh and say to him, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, Elohei, of the Hebrews, let my people go, send forth my people, that they may serve me. That they may serve me. Now go down to one more verse, and that is in chapter 10, verse 3. Chapter 10, verse 3. I want to establish that there is an end game to the send my people forth. Moses and Aaron came to Pharaoh and said to him, let's see, let me look at something in the Hebrew. Thus says Jehovah, Elohei ha'ivrim, the God of the Hebrews. Thus says Jehovah, God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me. That they may serve me. Now, I want to drill down on this. We've established at the initiation of the class that it's not just to let them go. It's not just to take them from the servitude of Pharaoh, but there is an end game in mind, a very important mission for which God has called this particular group of people called the Hebrews. All right, now look back with me. Go to Exodus 5. Exodus chapter 5, verse 1. And afterwards, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus says Jehovah, Elohei of Israel, send forth my people that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. This is a little bit different. There are two passages, we'll cover the other in just a moment, where after being told numerous times, send forth my people that they might serve me, there are two times where Jehovah tells Moses and Aaron to inform Pharaoh that they will be doing a festival, right? Now, in Hebrew and in English, the festival is not named. We don't know the name of the festival, but we know that there must be a chag, and we'll talk about the definition of that term. There must be a feast of some sort, because Jehovah tells Moses and Aaron to tell Pharaoh, let them go, send them forth, and they're going to keep a festival to me in the wilderness. Now look down at chapter 10, Exodus chapter 10. Exodus 10:9. And Moses said, We will go with our young and with our old, with our sons and with our daughters, with our flocks and with our herds. We will go, for we must hold a feast to Jehovah. You remember the phrase in this particular narrative. He's told, you can go, and Pharaoh bargains with him and says, well, maybe you can just bring the men, or maybe this, maybe that. Moses ultimately tells him, we will not even leave a hoof behind. Everything that we have and own is leaving. We've got to go. We've got to go keep this feast. We're going to go keep this feast. So twice, in Exodus 5:1 and Exodus 10:9, there is the mention of a feast that is not named. Now, what feast is it? We don't know what feast it is based on the text. But what we have to do then is study the evidence, look at what the text does tell us, and the argument from silence gives us the clue. In fact, our first clue is where I began at the story of the bush. This is going to be indicative of what is to follow. It gives us a clue as to the identity of the feast because a voice speaks from the midst of the fire at Horeb. This will be the sign of his coming. This particular burning, flaming, and then words speaking through the flame. All we know about the festival, based on the text in Exodus, in the Torah, is that it is called a Chag. Chag. Now, in Hebrew, you can see in your English translation, it will often be translated a feast or a festival. But literally, the Hebrew word, chag, means a circle or to go around, to whirl, to dance. It's this idea of festivity, so you can see where they get the word feast, but at its root meaning, it means to go around. Now, you can think about this. I always love to study Hebrew root words and think about what's the connection between the real meaning of the word and what it is the name of. For instance, at a festival, you can imagine people whirling and spinning and dancing and praising and rejoicing. See, that's the idea of Chag. It is generally associated with the pilgrimage festivals. So the pilgrimage festivals, according to the Hebrew Bible, we'll look at that in a minute. There are 3 that are mentioned. These are somewhat sacred processions. Now, let me mention one thing when we talk about Semitic language and the meaning of the word Chag. Some of you are familiar with the Muslim term, the Arabic phrase Hajj. The Hajj, which is the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. All right, that is tied to the same root word. In fact, the Arabic here, most linguists believe, the etymology of the word goes back to the Hebrew word chag. So think about that. So this idea of making it's really a mandatory, it's a commanded pilgrimage to go to a certain place in relation to the religion. All right. So these 3 pilgrimage festivals on the Hebrew calendar called Shlosh Regalim. The 3, it's like the foot, like you walk, the ones that you walk to, the ones that you use your feet to go to, right? These pilgrimage festivals. So I want to go through these quickly. Go with me to Exodus chapter 23. Exodus chapter 23. And let's go to verse 14. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me. 3 times you shall keep a feast to me, Chag, right, in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, in the time appointed in the month of Aviv. For in it you did come out from Egypt, and none shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field, and the feast of ingathering, which is at the end of the year, when you've gathered in the labors out of your field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before Jehovah your God. All right, so this idea is that these 3 times a year, the males, at least all the males, are to appear before Jehovah in Jerusalem, meaning the place where he has chosen to place his name. All right, and that's what the Torah describes. Now go with me to Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34. And I want to read beginning in verse 18. Let's see. Let me make sure that that this is the same. Yep. Okay. Actually, let's just scroll past. No, let's start in 18. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread as I commanded you in the time of the month of Aviv. For in the month of Aviv you did come out from Egypt. All that opens the womb is mine, and every firstling among your cattle, whether ox or sheep, that is male. But the firstling of an ass you shall redeem with a lamb. If you redeem it not, you shall break the neck. All the firstborn of your sons you shall redeem, and none shall appear before me empty. 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In plowing and in harvest you shall rest. In other words, there's no excuse not to keep Shabbat. If your farm is important, it's not important enough to work on Shabbat. All right. And you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before Jehovah Elohim, the God of Israel. All right. So in both of these cases, we're told that these are mandatory appearances, and that all males on these 3 occasions will appear before Jehovah. Now, look down at verse 27. And Jehovah said to Moses, write thou these words, for after the tenor of these words I've made a covenant with you and with Israel. Now, this particular chapter 34, is very interesting because some scholars will suggest that this is very interesting in that if you notice the context of chapter 34, Moses has broken the first set of tablets, and he is told in verse 1 to cut for himself a new set of 2 tablets like the first. He says, I'll write on these tablets the words that were on the first tablets, which you did break. Now, I've seen academic articles which suggest that the commandments which follow, though they're different, are another set of 10 commandments. Now, I'm not suggesting that's the case. I'm just saying in context it's interesting. But in the first verse, it gives it away. It says, I will write on these what I wrote on the first ones. However, at the end of chapter 34 in verse 27, after talking about the pilgrimage festivals and so forth, Moses is told to write these down, for it's after these words that I have made a covenant with you. So there is a connection to the covenant of Israel and Jehovah based on these things which we're talking about today. All right, now, go with me to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy chapter 16. Beginning in verse 16. 3 times a year shall all your males appear before Jehovah your God in the place which he shall choose. Here we go, in the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of booths. And they shall not appear before Jehovah empty. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of Jehovah your God, which he has given you. So it was during these times, especially, when all the males would come to appear before Jehovah, that they were encouraged to give liberally everything that they could give, whatever it was that they could afford to give. All right? Now, only one of these festivals, one of these that I have spoken about, in Exodus 23, Exodus 34, and Deuteronomy 16, only one fits the very purpose for which Jehovah brings out the children of Israel. So we know that it's not Passover and unleavened bread, because that's talking about when they left. We know it's not at the end of the year because the timing is wrong. We want to talk today about the other festival, but before I do, let me take the mystery deeper. The mystery is made even more mysterious in the Bible for several reasons. The only Chag that fits is not named. It's not absolutely named. There's no specific date that is assigned for this particular festival, this Chag. There's no specific date assigned, as with others. We know that Pesach is the 14th day of the first month, so forth. On this particular, on the unleavened bread, it begins on the 15th, and it's going to last for 7 days, right? And Sukkot, we know the dates. We know the date for Yom Teruah. We know these things, but what we don't know is a specific date for this other Chag. There is no specific event associated biblically with my mystery feast. Passover, what does it commemorate? Sukkot, what does it commemorate? In other words, we know that there are historical events associated therewith, but with this particular festival, it's not spelled out specifically. This is my point. Furthermore, whenever Ezekiel, the priestly prophet, who writes of, in chapter 45, 18 through 46, 7. I'm not going to cover that in today's class. I just want you to go look later. In Ezekiel 45, 18 through 46, 7, it is covering, call it the Olam Haba, the Messianic Age, the Third Temple period, whatever you want to call it. It is in the future, and there are listed various festivals, but the one I'm talking about today is not listed there. It vanishes. It makes me wonder why. Some would say it's just a scribal omission. I think it's purposeful. You have to wonder, why is it not there? But I'm going to be talking today about an event, a festival that is referred to as weeks. Shavuot. We're going to be talking today about a festival which is known to us from the ancient Greek literature, from the Apocrypha, from Josephus, from Philo, and from the Greek Christian New Testament as Pentecost. Because Pentecost indicates that we're talking about a 50-day period. Hebrew Bible refers to it as Shavuot, weeks. Now go with me to Leviticus chapter 23. Look, I just flipped right to it. Leviticus 23, beginning in verse 15. And you shall count for yourselves from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the omer of the wave offering, 7 complete Sabbaths shall there be. To the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days. You shall offer a new meal offering to Jehovah. You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves of 2/10 measures. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. They are the first fruits to Jehovah. And you shall offer with the bread 7 lambs without blemish of the first year, 1 young bullock, 2 rams. They shall be for a burnt offering to Jehovah, with their meal offering and their drink offerings, an offering made by fire of sweet savor to Jehovah. Then you will sacrifice 1 of the kids of the goats as a sin offering, 2 lambs of the first year for a sacrifice of peace offering. And the priest shall wave them with the bread of the first fruits for a wave offering before Jehovah with the 2 lambs. They'll be holy to Jehovah for the priest. And you shall proclaim on this very same day that it may be a holy gathering to you. You shall do no servile work. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not altogether remove the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them to the poor and to the stranger. I am Jehovah your God. And this gives us a good bit of detail about what anciently was done during the Feast of Weeks. How do you keep it? How do you count it? It seems fairly straightforward. You begin the morrow after the Sabbath, and you're going to number these days. Count them off. 1, 2, all the way to 50. All right? Seems simple enough, right? Who could have a problem with that? And what I want to also draw your attention to is the way that this ends. We're talking about harvest, a particular festival which is about the harvest, and notice the underscoring point. Don't forget the stranger. Don't forget the poor. Leave some of those corners. And people debate, how big is the corner? Well, the corner, that's up to you. I think that's between you and God. You know, how much do you do for the poor? What can you afford to allow the poor to glean? You know, during Shavuot, the book of Ruth is very commonly read for obvious associations within the text. Now, the idea, though, that I want to underscore is don't forget the poor, don't forget the stranger. We're going to come back to this in a few moments. Go back to Deuteronomy 16, Deuteronomy chapter 16. And I'm going to begin in verse 9. "7 weeks shall you number to yourself. For such time, from such time as you begin to put the sickle to the corn, you shall commence to number 7 weeks. And you shall keep the feast of weeks to Jehovah your God with a tribute of a freewill offering of your hand, which you shall give according as Jehovah your God has blessed you. And you shall rejoice before Jehovah your God, you and your son and your daughter and your maidservant, your manservant, and the Levite who is within your gates, and the stranger and the fatherless and the widow that are among you in the place which Jehovah your God has chosen as a residence of his name. And you shall remember that you were a bondman in Egypt. Therefore you shall observe and do these statutes." I want to share a couple of things with you that I read. I love Deuteronomy. At Deuteronomy, the focus, notice, is on inclusivity. Everybody. Everything else we've read talks about the males are going to appear, you know, and there are going to be these sacrifices and so forth. Notice how Moses records this in Deuteronomy 16. He includes everybody. Can you think of anyone who doesn't fit within the broad description that I just read? Servants, men, women servants. Let's not get both, right? You work your way through. You read about everyone from the priest, the Levite, the stranger, fatherless, widow, everyone. And notice, you shall remember that you were a slave in Egypt. So in Leviticus, he says, don't forget the poor and the stranger. Here in Deuteronomy, he says, don't forget that you were a slave. The Torah will at times put those together. More than 30 times the stranger is mentioned. And treatment, kind treatment of the stranger. It's such a powerful point that sort of underlines everything that the Torah is about. I know that there are people who are exclusive in the Torah faith movement. They would leave people out. But the inclusiveness of the Torah is what I appreciate especially. I mean, there are Torah teachers who will tell people, don't even bother trying to keep the Torah. It's not for you, it's for me. And I get a picture of a child saying, mine, mine, mine. It's to go to the world. It's to be to the ends of the earth. Your job, and we'll see this, Israel, is to teach the nations. What are you going to teach them something for if they're not ultimately to keep it? The Sabbath was way before there was an Israel, for instance. So let's be careful. Ultimately, people will flow to Jerusalem. All people, all nations. My house, Isaiah says in chapter 56, will be a house of prayer for all people. In Zechariah 14, where it talks about all the nations of the earth will be sending delegates to Jerusalem to keep this Chag known as Sukkot. I mean, there are some who would suggest that if you're not an Israelite, you can't keep Sukkot. There ought to be a sukkah in every nation around this world, in Zimbabwe, in Canada, in the U.S., and every state, every city, every parish, every county. See, ultimately, the Torah is to go forth to all people. Deuteronomy makes that very, very clear. Notice also that Deuteronomy makes it a point to say that this is a time of rejoicing. Now, back to the ambiguity of the date. Count 50 days. Every one of you can count to 50. Seems like it would be easy enough, so long as you know the starting point. You know, in other words, if you said, Ross, I want you to count 50 days from right now, I would say right now, like start today. Today is day one. Yes, Ross, today is day one. I'm just making sure. Because if you say start counting 50 days and I think it's tomorrow I begin, you want me to start now or tomorrow? Today. You see, but if you don't know when to start, you're going to reach a difficulty on what day does it end. And see, I'm telling you today that the thing that started at the bush, actually, as we work through the story, what began at Passover is meant to bring us to an end game. I want to show you the end game. So there was a debate on the date. A debate on the date that led to a chain of successive interpretations in the Second Temple period. Now, I know people who have latched on to one or the other and will fight you tooth and nail on Facebook, because that's where all the world's problems are solved, about which methodology ought to be used. And it's not just about Shavuot, it's about the new moon or whatever. I mean, people love to fight and bicker. So what we know is that we know this. Let's start with what we know. I always like to start with what we know. Shavuot follows Passover. All right, everybody can agree. You can shake your head and say, yeah, that's obvious. We know that the count begins from the morrow after the Sabbath. Now, this is where the difficulties arose. Because you would read it and you'd go, wait a minute. So I begin the count the day after the Sabbath? You're like, yeah, that's right. Now, some people are going, I got it, and they're off, and they start the count right after the... But then the question arose. I'm not going to get into the details of this because we don't have enough in the day to get through all this, but just to highlight. The question becomes, what do you mean by Sabbath? Because if we don't know what you mean by the morrow after the Sabbath, I think if we get the Sabbath, I know what the morrow is. I know to begin the day. But the question was, the Pharisees said this, that the Sabbath that is referred to here is talking about Passover. And you go, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, it's a pretty good argument because it is a Shabbat, right? So they said no matter what day of the week that the Passover fell, let's say the 14th of the first month happened on a Tuesday, then they would start the count on Wednesday. And that's the way it works. So you begin on the 15th and you count 50 days. So it kind of brings you to the same day, which will flow through the week. Does that make sense? Now, there were other groups that argued different opinions here. There were the Sadducees. There were those at Qumran. Some suggested that the Sabbath in this particular text is that which falls. Remember, unleavened bread is 7 days, so they would begin it at the Sabbath within that week. Some would use the Sabbath at the end of unleavened bread. So you get all these differences. And look, these were no small arguments. These were very big arguments. And guess what? It's still a big argument. People are still fighting over this. And I love to study this kind of stuff. But that's not my point today. It was agreed that Shavuot occurred in the third month. So we know that, right? I mean, everybody will shake hands on that. The Karaites, the Messianic Israelites, the Messianic Israel Alliance, the Jews for Judah, everybody who's Hebraically and biblically literate, all of us would agree that we're at least in the right month. I mean, thank God we can start there, right? We're at least in the right month. But it seems, and this is what I want to get to, that Shavuot is in a way a conclusion, the closure for what began at Pesach in Egypt. So we begin with Passover, and it's connected. There's a connection. There's a tie between Pesach and Shavuot, between Passover and weeks. You see, there in Egypt, the Hebrews were enslaved, but they were sent forth to serve Jehovah. This is repeated throughout, as I made the point early in the class. Shalakatami, I just thought of a mixing Hebrew and English rhyme. Shalakatami, to serve me. Well, it's not really a rhyme, but it sounds cool. Send forth my people to serve me. Now, let me tell you why I think this is so important. Go with me to Exodus chapter 14. Exodus chapter 14. It's not just sending them forth, but it's not just a deliverance from servitude to Pharaoh. Watch this. In Exodus 14, Shemot 14, verse 5. Now, this is after they've departed. And it was told the king of Egypt that the people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh and his servants was turned against the people, and they said, notice what they say, why have we done this? That we have let Israel go from serving us. See, they just lost all their workforce. They realized that no matter how bad things have been going prior to sending them forth, that now they don't have their servants. The key point is that Israel was a servant in Egypt. Israel was a slave. Now, I brought this up previously in my teaching. Some people get a little squirmish here. I'm just being biblical. I'm being real. Israel is still a slave, a servant. If you understand what I mean by slave. A lot of people, it's just the word. They don't like the word. So call it servant. We're dealing with the idea that Israel's true calling is to be a servant. Not to Pharaoh, not to Egypt, but to the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were freed from Egyptian bondage, but they were freed to serve Jehovah. See, that's the trick. They left in one way. The servitude was sealed at a place called Sinai, but they leave from the bondage of Egypt and become bonded to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It happened at Sinai. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the word Sinai, the name Sinai, is used 34 times. Horeb is used 17 times. And you can get into, you ought to do a study on this and see how it all maps out. You know, Exodus is fairly consistent in the use of Sinai, using Horeb only 3 times. And then Deuteronomy, for instance, uses Horeb almost exclusively, except for an example that I'm going to give you in a few moments. You say, why is that? Horeb, Sinai, this is it's an interesting study, I'll just say that. You see, it was here at Sinai that what Moses was shown alone while tending sheep, an entire people would witness. Remember, he's told, this is a sign. You'll serve God, Ha-Elohim, upon this mountain. So what Moses was shown in the micro, the people would see in the macro. They're going to see a voice. You say, well, that's a strange way to word it. You're going to see a voice from the midst of the fire. I want to add this point. What this event signifies is that the delivery from bondage is never complete until one assumes, takes on the yoke of the kingdom of God. You will never be free until you take on the yoke of the kingdom. It's my understanding. There is a freedom. Now, this is not what's taught in many religious circles, as you know. A lot of people see that the law brings one into bondage, and they see that as a very negative thing. But it's an attachment to the servanthood for which Israel is called, and it's very, very important. Shavuot, then, is a completion of a transfer of servitude from one master to another. You know the old song, you're going to have to serve somebody. From the pharaohs of the old order to Jehovah of the new. We're talking about a transition of authority. For it was at Sinai 50 days. I believe it was on a Sunday that ancient Israel became the servant nation with one master. They now belong to Jehovah exclusively as a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Go with me to Exodus 19. Exodus 19, beginning in verse 4. Let me go back to verse 3. And Moses went up to God. Jehovah called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Yaakov, tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to Egypt and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if, you know what the Hebrew says? If you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant or guard my covenant, then you shall be my own segulah, my own special treasure from among all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is the calling. This is what it all leads to. This servant nation is to be a holy nation, set apart, separate from the nations. A kingdom, yes, but a kingdom of priests. The anticipation begins to grow in Exodus chapter 19 towards the anticipated third day. The day that Moses had been told, get this, Jehovah will come down. This is not a Messiah we're talking about. talking about Jehovah. I want you to look at verse 10 of Exodus 19. Jehovah said to Moses, "Go to the people, sanctify them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes and be ready for the third day. For on the third day, Jehovah will come down in the sight of all the people upon Mount Sinai." Interesting. Now, here's where people's theology jumps in and we make excuses for what the text says and so forth. But I just want to let the power of the text, let's do something today. Let's let the text speak for itself. I just think it's interesting. That's Exodus 19:10. Now go to Exodus 19, verse 17. Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain, and Mount Sinai smoked in every part because Jehovah descended upon it in fire. If you have a nice pencil, you can underline that softly. And the smoke of it ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly, and the voice of the shofar sounded louder and louder. Moses speaks, and God answers him by a voice. Verse 20, and Jehovah came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and Jehovah called Moses up to the top of the mount, and Moses went up, and so forth and so on. Jehovah came down. I called this class the first coming. This event that we're talking about here in Exodus 19 and 20 in particular has never been superseded. Nothing like this has ever happened. Not since. This was a watershed event. This was something which basically birthed the nation. I'd call it the first coming of Jehovah. He manifested by voice to an entire nation in an awe-inspiring event. It was so fear-inspiring that the people went to Moses and said, "Let's not do this again." I'm paraphrasing. You go talk to God, and you come back and tell us what he said, and we'll do it. But let's not do this again. I mean, there are thunders and lightning. I mean, have you ever been in a really terrible storm? And it is a little bit awe-inspiring, or you might even be afraid. But think about that. And the sound of a shofar growing louder and louder, and the quake of the mountain is shaking. You know, there are traditional stories about the mount suspending over the people. You don't have to make stories up that aren't in the Bible. It's fearful enough, right? Nowhere in the Bible does it says either accept this covenant or I'll drop this mountain on you. That's not in the text. People get stories. They make up stories because it says they stood at the foot of and the root word there is tachat, which can mean under. I mean, come on, look. We're talking about a fear-inspiring event. Thunder, lightning, earthquake, sound of a shofar. People are terrified. It was Sinai, the first coming. Go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 33. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 2. Now this is, by the way, the blessing. You can read this. Let me read verse 1. And this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And he said, Jehovah came from Sinai and rose up from Seir to them. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from holy multitudes. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. In Hebrew, Eshdat, a fiery law for them. See, he came from Sinai. This is an interesting read. Look at, let's go to Judges 5, book of Judges, chapter 5. And I've just got a couple of these picked out. Judges 5:5 is all I'm going to read. The mountains melted from before Jehovah, that Sinai before Jehovah Elohim of Israel. I'm just looking at something here. Elohei Yisrael. Jehovah Elohei Yisrael. So we're talking about Sinai, and the mountains melted. This idea, you could almost picture the rocks coming down because of the earthquake. It's poetic language, but the idea is to give you a visual of the fearfulness of what's going on at this particular story. Go with me to the book of Nehemiah, chapter 9, verse 13. All right, let's see. Help if I get in the right book. All right. Nehemiah 9, verse 13 says this. And you did come down upon Mount Sinai, and did speak with them from heaven, and gave them right judgments and true Torot, good statutes and commandments, and you did make known to them your holy Sabbath, and did command them precepts, statutes, and Torah by the hand of Moses your servant. You did come down on Mount Sinai. This has not happened since. It's the first coming is what we're talking about. Now look, let me give you one from the Psalms just so you have it in your notes. Psalm 68. When I talked about the name last week, I began with Psalm 68. It is, I love Psalm 68, but in Psalm 68, I just want to read a couple of passages, verses 8 and 9. O God, when you did go out before your people, when you did march through the wilderness, Selah, the earth shook, the heavens also dropped at the presence of God, even Sinai itself at the presence of God, the God of Israel. Now look down at verse 17, Psalm 68, verse 17. Let's see. O high-peaked hill, hill of Bashan, why dost thou look askance? And, O high-peaked hill, at the mountain which God has desired for his abode. Truly, Jehovah will dwell there forever. The chariots of God are twice 10,000, thousands upon thousands. Jehovah is among them, Sinai in holiness. You have ascended on high, you've led captivity captive, and it goes on. The importance of Sinai and the idea that God came there and interacted with his people is the central point of which everything in the Exodus pointed to. It's the culmination of all the miraculous interactions. Everything points to Sinai. Tragically, people have ignored Sinai. You see, it's what happened at Sinai that sets the stage for anything that follows. People who reject Sinai, you may as well throw it away, because that's where it begins. In Judaism, Shavuot is called Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah. And that's a good name. Because what happens after this event and the storm and the fearful noises and the shofar and the earthquake is that Jehovah speaks these words. Let's go, we can read Exodus 19 and 20, but let's go to Deuteronomy. I want to read Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy 5. And I'm just going to see. Okay. This is Moses' firsthand account. Now, if you go to a Shavuot service, I think, John, you guys are going to Chabad this week, they're going to read Exodus 20. And in the all-night study session, I was there last year, one of the things that I asked him was, I said, why don't we talk about Deuteronomy 5? And he said, well, and we had this discussion. But it is important. There's significant differences between Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. And I think they're important to cover. So, because most of you who may be going to do something with a Jewish congregation, you're going to get Exodus 20. So here you go, Deuteronomy 5. Let me start verse 2. Jehovah our God made a covenant with us in Horeb. Jehovah made not this covenant with our fathers, but with us, even us, who are all of us here alive this day. Jehovah talked with you face to face in the mountain, out of the midst of fire. I stood between Jehovah and you at that time to show you the word of Jehovah, for you were afraid by reason of the fire and went not up to the mountain. Saying, and here it is, I am Jehovah your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself any carved idol or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the waters beneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them. Here's our word. For I, Jehovah your God, am a jealous God, punishing the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth of those who hate me, and showing mercy to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of Jehovah your God in vain, for Jehovah will not hold him guiltless that takes his name in vain. Keep the Sabbath day to sanctify it, as Jehovah your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of Jehovah your God. On it shall you not do any work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your maidservant, nor your manservant, nor your ox, nor your ass, nor any of your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you. And remember that you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and that Jehovah your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and a stretched out arm. Therefore Jehovah your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. Honor your father and your mother, as Jehovah your God has commanded you, that your days may be prolonged, and that it may go well with you in the land which Jehovah your God gives you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, neither shall you steal, neither shall you bear false witness against your neighbor, neither shall you covet your neighbor's wife, neither shall you desire your neighbor's house, his field, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's. These are the words that make up what in the Hebrew Bible called the Edut, the testimony. The testimony. The Decalogue. They're called the 10 Commandments, but in Hebrew it's called the 10 words, as you know. There are more than 10 commandments in the 10 Commandments. The idea is that these words were written with the very finger of God on tablets of stone. One of my favorite quotes comes from the late Rabbi Hertz in his commentary. James Tabor quotes this, a part of this, in Restoring Abrahamic Faith. Listen to this. The 10 Commandments. The 10 words or commandments, the Decalogue, are supreme among the precepts of the Torah, both on account of their fundamental and far-reaching importance and on account of the awe-inspiring manner in which they were revealed to the whole nation. Amid thunder and lightning and the sounding of the shofar, amid flames of fire that enveloped the smoking mountain, a majestic voice pronounced the words from which that day to this have been the guide of conduct to mankind. That revelation was the most remarkable event in the history of humanity. It was the birth hour of the religion of the Spirit, which was destined in time to illumine the souls, order the lives of all the children of men. The Decalogue is a sublime summary of human duties binding upon all mankind, a summary unequaled for simplicity, comprehensiveness, and solemnity, a summary which bears divinity on its face and cannot be antiquated as long as the world endures. It is at the same time a divine epitome of the fundamental of Israel's creed in life, and Jewish teachers, ancient and modern, have looked upon it as the fountainhead from which all Jewish truth and Jewish teaching could be derived. These commandments are written on the walls of synagogue and church. They are the world's laws for all time. Never will their empire cease. Their prophetic cry is true. The word of our God shall stand forever. This, in some way, begins to describe the significance of the words which Jehovah wrote with his finger on tablets of stone, on the Edut. They were and are the single greatest proof that God so loved the world. When God wrote this, He, in a sense, gave the greatest gift to humanity. Imagine a world living according to these truths. We turn on the news and we see the horrors of our times. There's untold bad, but let me tell you this, there's also untold good. A lot of people have a very negative appraisal of the world totally. I see it's a battle. It's always been a battle between the good and the bad, between the right and the wrong, between the light and the darkness. But these words shine a light into a world of darkness, signaling forever that Sinai is the source from which the light originally beamed. These words are a lamp to the feet, a light to the path. They're perfect, converting the soul. They bring blessing and life to those who live thereby. I mean, think about that. The life and blessing. And they also bring about the love of the one who dwelt in the bush. Now, for the enemies of Jehovah, they also received 10 things, 10 blows, 10 plagues. Measure for measure. The enemies of our God received 10 things. The children of Israel received 10 things. And, I might add, the mixed multitude who were assembled with them, who followed and went with the children of Israel. This group assembled at Sinai received a truth not to keep for themselves, not to bury under a bushel, not to hide, but to shine forth, to be a servant. The enemies received 10 plagues. Israel received the keys to the kingdom. But Israel has to be careful. To whom much is given, much is required. You cannot, not only have there been opportunities to go in and they didn't, but at times they've actually locked out those who desire to follow the truths laid forth in the Torah. It's a dangerous thing. These keys are the keys to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jehovah once at Sinai, whose location is a mystery, on a Chag, a festival, a feast, whose name is unspoken, on a day which has been debated since antiquity, gave a very special gift. Today, we're in the third month, all desiring to keep the unnamed festival, seeking to be servants of Jehovah, many of you in the comfort of your own home. I'll leave you with this question. On this day, according to the Jewish calendar, tomorrow is Shavuot. I feel like I'm asking you to prepare yourself. Without debating the exact day or this calendar or that calendar, if you want to wait a week and be in concert with some other Torah teacher who said that's the day, look, I don't want to delay. I want to ask you today, are you willing to say with ancient Israel, all that Jehovah has spoken, we will do? See, that's the important thing. You can debate all you want, but this is the important question. Think about everything that we've talked about, the inclusivity, the idea that we should be open and inviting. I mean, look, I can argue theology with anybody, and they can argue theology with me. The important thing is, are we open? Do we distinguish people based upon class? Or do we say, look, if you're a manservant, a maidservant, a stranger, the Torah was given to all. Israel has a job. It's to be a servant, to be a light to the nation, a covenant of the people. Their job, Israel's job, is to shine forth and bring this to the nations of the world. And it also is incumbent upon any who have accepted this truth. The mixed multitude had the same charge. They weren't told, no, you just keep these 7. I know God just gave us 10, but you just do this. No, everyone assembled received that message. And so have you. You see, Jehovah's heart cry in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 29 and 26, verse 26 in the Hebrew. Oh, that they had such a heart as this always. To fear me and guard all my commandments all the days, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom. Now, we're not going to have a dialogue today, but I want to wish every one of you a Chag Sameach, and in whatever way that you keep the festival and on whatever day that you keep the festival, remember the true intent and what it's all about. Shabbat Shalom.